Following last week's requests from certain guys, they were asking about the maintenance of the T4. So what do I do to the car in between races? Because a lot of times you see me posting pictures of the car in pieces, and yeah, I'm working on something on the car and I'm maintaining it between the races. So what is it that I'm doing exactly during those maintenance sessions? And I'm going to explain that to you today in more detail, what is needed to be done between the races as in terms of maintenance. So I'm going to start with showing the parts of the drivetrain which you need to look out for. So for instance, the quick check is obviously that you take the pinion off and you just try to spin the drivetrain with your fingers to make sure it's free and there's no binding anywhere. And there should be just a very light resistance in the drivetrain if you have set the belt tension properly, and if your bearings are free and such. So just check that first. After that, obviously you need to take the drivetrain apart to check it more carefully in detail, but you can get a good overview of how the drivetrain is in its condition. So then you move on to check the drive shafts. So I made a video a couple of weeks ago about the front drive shaft, the ECS, and how to rebuild it. So you already know how to do that if you've seen that video. So you just apply the same procedure to the rear drive shaft, even though the wear of the rear drive shaft is significantly less than the front. So you would have to rebuild the fronts more frequently than the rears probably, but I usually rebuild them at the same time. And the same goes for the drive shaft caps, the blades. You need to replace those when you rebuild the drive shafts too. And when you have the drive shafts out, it's very easily done to check the bearings as well. So in this case, the smaller bearing is for the drive shaft here. So what you can do is you either use the Hoodie bearing checker tool, which is quite popular, or you can just put the bearing on the drive shaft and simply spin it to see that it's free. These bearings right here are ceramic bearings, so X-Ray offered these bearings as a bearing set, but the bearings I use in my car right here are bearings from Avid. It's a brand called Avid. They have a bearing called Aura. So the bearing doesn't have any seal on the inside, which means it's very free and easy to maintain. And what you need to pay attention to with the bearings is when you run on carpet, make sure there's no threads from the carpet or small hairs getting stuck in the bearings, because when they get sucked into the bearing, they will destroy the bearing. So you need to pay attention to small hairs from the carpet coming into the bearings. And if you run outdoors on asphalt, if you run on dusty tracks, you're gonna have more problems with the bearings and you're gonna need more maintenance on the bearings. So what I do is, these bearings, they come greased from the factory. So what I do is I spray out the grease with a brake cleaner, so they are completely dry. And then I add a tiny bit of Hoodie bearing oil, a very thin oil, just a little bit. And then I keep applying the oil in between runs or in between races to the bearings. And when they start to feel crunchy, it's time to replace them. The same goes for the diff bearings, same procedure, just a bigger bearing. For the rear diff bearings, you may need to clean them more often because they will collect some silicone oil from the diff. So that will make them less free, and you need to spray them out more often than the front diff bearings. As for the belts, the rear belt will have more wear than the front. Especially in modified racing, you'll find yourself replacing the rear belt much more often. So for modified, I would probably say for every major race you should use a new rear belt, whereas the front belt lasts much longer. So you can use the front belt probably 2, 3 or 4 months. It will last a long time. So unless you run on very poor conditions with a lot of dust, it will last a long time. So the poly, that obviously in this case is optional graphite plastic poly. If you've had a problem with the belt, like if you had some breakage or the teeth coming off or something, often it is the case that the poly is damaged as well, so you need to look out for damage on the poly. And you also need to look for dirt getting stuck between the teeth on the poly. So you can use either a hobby knife or use a screwdriver to take the small rubber bits or the small dust out from in between the teeth. It's very important to check also when you do maintenance. And as for the kit's plastics, some guys ask me, do you need to replace the plastics on the car? To be honest, on the X-Ray car, the plastics are very good, they're very strong. They don't wear very much, so my honest answer is, these plastics right here, like the steering block, the front C-hub, and also the suspension arm and the rear hub, I don't really replace them. I mean, I can use the same plastic for that lifetime of the car. So in this case, usually it's around 6 months. I can use the same plastics with the same performance. I mean, if you take a look at your car and you feel that the suspension has too much play or doesn't feel right in some direction, then it doesn't hurt to replace the plastics. But to be honest, it's not really necessary unless you had some breakage or you run on conditions where you have a lot of wear. So the same goes for the ball cups. If you feel that you have excessive play in the ball cups, you need to replace them. But usually they'll last a very long time, and you will not have a big improvement in performance from replacing them. So I usually use the same set for the lifetime of the car. More than that, I mean, the shock towers we never replace unless we have a crash. The aluminum parts, for example, the bulkheads and the upper bulkheads, we don't replace unless we had a crash where they are bent or where they cause tweaks somehow. The carbon parts such as the top deck, you need to check it if you had a crash, because it might bend or make the car tweaked. Something you need to pay attention to is some people they take off the top deck, they put it on the board to see if it's flat, and sometimes it is flat, but you need to pay attention to this small part of the top deck right here, right behind the motor, because there's very little material here, it's very thin. So the top deck may seem straight, but it might be slightly cracked in the carbon right here, so you need to check for this section that nothing is cracked. So watch out for this section of the top deck. When you race on asphalt, you're gonna have a lot of wear on the chassis, especially on big tracks with fast corners and with bumps. So if you race on bumpy tracks outdoors, you're gonna have a lot of chassis wear, and this means the chassis gets thinner when you run it. And if you do it for too long time, you're gonna have a too soft chassis because it will affect the flex. So what I would do, what I would recommend on asphalt is keep replacing the chassis as often as you can afford, because it will really help your performance, and especially if you are in a situation where you need to replace the chassis because of a crash or such, then you can actually have a more similar performance if your chassis had less wear, if the case is you need to put a new one on the car. So for instance, if you ran a really old chassis and you had a crash, there's no way you can make the car feel the same again, because you're gonna have to put a new chassis on the car. And that's a very important thing for asphalt. I mean, on carpet you don't really need to replace it unless something is bent. But on asphalt, the chassis is pretty critical, so pay attention to that. I mean, those were the most important bits of maintenance. I mean, if you have any questions, just let me know in the comments. I will try to answer them. I think this should cover it, but yeah, let me know if you have any questions at all.